So we're continuing on with our sermon series, the Discipleship Narratives. And, in the season of Lent, our discipleship series has kind of taken this twist, this movement a little bit, this sort of change of focus to focus more on sort of what Lent, the season of Lent is really all about. Or one of the big things I should say that Lent is all about. And it's that idea of just kind of coming back, settling down, being silent, being quiet, contemplating and considering the cross. Lent, in many ways, is a journey. It's a journey that moves us closer and closer to the cross as we get closer and closer to Good Friday and to Easter. One of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis, wrote a bunch of stuff. I've read a bunch of his stuff, not all of his stuff. My second favorite C.S. Lewis book is not one that most of us have ever heard of, not one that we tend to think of. It's this little book, fairly little book, short book. So yes, I have read now, was it 3 books in 4 weeks? I'm on a roll. Man, am I on a roll. So it's this little book by the name of The Great Divorce. And The Great Divorce, it's odd, it's a little awkward, it's an allegory, so it's full of all sorts of sort of weird scenes and weird kind of things being said and events and all that sort of thing that can oftentimes leave you kind of scratching your head, because the whole idea is that all this stuff, almost everything that happens in The Great Divorce it's a metaphor in so many ways. It's sort of, it alludes to something else that doesn't really seem like it really is what it is. And The Great Divorce is this book about C.S. Lewis and how he basically imagines what it would be like to take a trip to heaven and to experience heaven, to see what heaven is like. It's this fascinating book, really fascinating book. And in this story, as you go along, people like you and me are depicted as being almost ghost-like in this world that we do find out is actually heaven. They are depicted as being almost ghost-like. And the world around them, heaven around them, nature, trees, bushes, grass is hard, it's solid. So there's this one scene, there's a couple scenes actually, and one in particular that's really kind of vivid in so many ways, where C.S. Lewis, as the narrator, C.S. Lewis is walking around, he's walking through this meadow, and he recalls how the grass of the meadow is not bending and moving out of the way as he walks through it and as we would expect. Instead, it's hard, it's firm, and it pokes him and it jabs him, and it leaves these little marks, these little almost kind of paper cut marks. It's actually kind of a painful experience, because everything there is just so much more solid and hard than what Lewis is himself. And that has this uncanny sort of thing, or a result where some of the people that Lewis is on this trip to heaven with, some people, they embrace this solidness and this realness as something that is more real, more solid, more definite than the world and earth as they have ever experienced it. And they crave that, and they get excited about that, and they want to stay there. Whereas other people, they experience this, and they have these experiences, and it almost drives them mad, because they long for what they know, and it's too painful to be in heaven surrounded by all of this solidness. Lewis meets somebody, a Scottish poet, who is typically just kind of referred to as his guide, Lewis's guide. And at one point, as you get toward the end of the book, there's this fascinating scene that has stuck with me for about 15 years now, ever since I first read the book. It's a scene where Lewis and his guide are standing in this meadow, and they're looking at the edge of this forest, this wood, and there's this parade that's coming through the forest. And there are these huge creatures that are really ultimately described as angels, but you just don't really know exactly what they are at first. There's these huge creatures, and there's music, and there's dancing, and there's a woman whose beauty Lewis just can't even find the words to even describe. There's this woman who is being carried, kind of like, I don't know, like in that little movie Cleopatra, kind of on this little chair thing. I don't even know what they call it. And she's being carried and marched around, and it's the epitome of royal processions. And Lewis is so overtaken by the sight that his initial reaction is that this woman is God. That's who he thinks he's looking at, because to him there's no other way, no other explanation for what he's witnessing unless this was actually God coming and approaching him. And so he looks at his guide and he says, is that who I think it is? And his guide says, well, no, it's not. In fact, you have no idea who that person is. You've never heard about her. hardly anybody has ever heard about her. She's not anybody who stands out. And Lewis says, well, but look at this. I mean, she's got to be somebody of importance, right? And his guide says, well, yeah, she is somebody important. She's one of the great ones, is the wording that his guide uses. And as this conversation goes on, his guide finally comes to what I think is probably one of the best lines in the whole book, where his guide says, you may have heard it said that fame in this land is quite different than fame on earth. Fame on this land is quite different than fame on earth. What Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, what it does is it pulls out and it really brings home in this very, very vivid and rich way a certain truth, a certain reality about the kingdom of God. In that the kingdom, as we are welcomed into as God's people, the kingdom is a upside down world as far as how we might understand. Those people who tend to be forgotten and overlooked and ignored are so often those people who are given these places of highest honor and position in the kingdom. It's upside down. It doesn't make sense to us. We're going to encounter that this morning in our text as we go to Matthew chapter 20. Let me pray a second and then we'll take a look at the verses for today. Heavenly Father, Lord, pray that you open our ears, open our hearts, open our minds, that we may hear and see and be transformed, that we may be changed and moved as we grow, as we understand, as we serve you, as we worship you. In Jesus' name, amen. Matthew chapter 20 is where we're going this morning. We are getting closer to Jerusalem, closer to the cross as we go through, as we follow Jesus along this journey, along this road to Jerusalem. Matthew chapter 20, I'm going to start reading at verse 20. Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons and, kneeling down, asked a favor of him. I'm going to stop there for a second because we need to orient ourselves. You got to figure this out. Matthew's kind of being a little bit cryptic, a little bit sort of, uncertain about who exactly are we talking about here. All we know really, all we have, the best we have is the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons. But who is this? Who are we talking about? So this is kind of a long way around it, but essentially what Matthew is talking about and who's in view here are the disciples that we know as James and John. You think back all the way back to Matthew chapter 4. So you're going back a couple months now in our series, all the way back to Matthew chapter 4, when Jesus called the first disciples, his first disciples. There was Peter, there was Andrew, and then there were two boys who were described initially as the sons of Zebedee, James and John. Zebedee is not being mentioned here, but here we have his mother, or here we have their mom, Zebedee's wife, is coming to Jesus. So it's kind of weird. It's kind of a different way of talking about it, but that's who we're talking about here. We're talking about James and John. So 21. So they go to Jesus and their mom says this. What is it? Or Jesus says this. What is it you want? He asked. And she said, grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. That's audacious, right? I mean, that's audacious. This is James and John, their mom. They're already disciples. They were handpicked by Jesus. And here's their mom. Their mom comes along and he says, Jesus, if you really love my sons, you know what would make my day? I mean, this would be the greatest thing ever. Here's what I want you to do. Just one favor. Make my sons the second and third highest in the kingdom. Right after you. I believe, Jesus, you are the Messiah. You're the King. You're going to establish your kingdom. It's going to be great. Put my sons, number 2 and number 3, right behind you. There's a term that was getting tossed around a lot a couple of years ago. It's still kind of floating around out there a little bit now, but it's this term called helicopter parenting. All right, and it's something that admittedly my generation gets a really bad rap at this, and there's some good reasons for why that is. We've kind of deserved it, we kind of own it, but the whole idea of helicopter parenting, this idea that we as parents, sometimes we are so kind of desperate for the success of our kids or for the safety and for the well-being of our children that we almost kind of hover over them. So everywhere they go, there's mom or there's dad. You never really let your kids too far out of your sight. You never let them go too far. Remember, as As a kid, most Saturdays and most summer vacations, I'd get up in the morning, I'd eat my Lego waffles or whatever they are, Eggo waffles, eat my Eggo waffles, get on my bike, and I'd take off, and I'd be all over town. And I don't recall my dad ever asking me, where'd you go and what did you do or anything. Maybe he did, and I'm just blocking that out. I don't know. But but we don't do that anymore as parents. We just don't let our kids do it. And there's stories, you hear some of these just crazy stories sometimes about parents who let their kids play outside in the front yard without the parents sitting out there, and the parents are getting a call from the cops because of that, because somebody else saw them and thought their kids were in danger. And so you get kind of this hyper defensive mode that kind of seeps in as parents. Some of the reading I did this week, some of the extreme cases and examples out there are, there's a story that I came across, kind of helicopter parenting type story, where a mom called up the college president of the school that her son was going to because her son had a disagreement with his roommate and couldn't figure out how to get it taken care of. So mom calls the president, thinking the president's going to step into this roommate issue. All right. There's other stories out there, and I've heard this one a number of times, where prospective employers are being called up, or sometimes even interviewees are bringing their parents along to the interview in the hope that their parents will be able to convince their hopeful boss to give them a job. It doesn't work out, all right? If your parents are tempted to do it, it doesn't work. Employers don't like that when that happens. And college presidents have way more to deal with than your kids fighting with their roommates. But anyways, there's this helicopter parenting thing that kind of has seeped into our culture, and we think that this is a new phenomenon, but here we have James and John's mom doing the exact same thing 2,000 years ago. She's going to say, Jesus, please, let me pull my weight in there. Let me do something here, all right? Put my two sons at the top. I'm petitioning on the part of my two sons. What? Why? I mean, what is that? What is that about? What's going on there? Why can't James and John just have the guts to go to Jesus himself and ask this? And there's kind of this, some thinking that goes around a little bit, and I've come across that kind of suggests that back in the first century, in both Jewish culture and Roman culture, there was a tendency to think that a mother actually had more influence and pull than what the sons did in culture. So if a son really wanted something, really wanted a position, it was actually in his best interest to say, Mom, will you go and talk to so-and-so and help me get that position? That's exactly what James and John are doing here. So it's not their mom who's asking for her own reasons. She's actually going because James and John prompted her to go to Jesus. This is James and John's problem. It's not their mom's problem. This is James and John. This is their problem. Their ego stepping in, and they're trying to push some weight around. They're trying to manipulate Jesus to give them something that they really, really want. So it's just kind of more of that orientation stuff. Verse 22. You don't know what you are asking, Jesus said to them. Can you drink the cup I am going to drink? Well, we can, they answered. And Jesus said to them, you will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or my left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father. You don't know what you're asking. You're ignorant. You don't get it. I mean, let's just start. Bottom line, baseline here. I mean, what is the baseline? Let's just start with the baseline. Can you do what I'm going to Jerusalem to do? Can you do that? Because if you can't even do that, don't even pretend, don't even try to ask me for a high position in the kingdom. Can you do what I am about to do? And Jesus says, yeah, you are going to do it. And they all kind of have their own ways. And church history kind of tells us, there were some similarities there. But Jesus is making a point. This is hard. You really don't get it. You're coming at this, you're asking this question from the wrong perspective, from the wrong place, with the wrong motivation. Let's go back to the great divorce there for a second. That scene with the parade and the anonymous woman and the line that statement that was made by the guide. You've heard it said that fame in this land is quite different from fame on earth. You see, the disciples, James and John specifically, were looking at this, and they were still approaching this whole kingdom business and this whole discipleship business using the same framework and the same viewpoint that we so often use even to ourselves. They were using the same framework and the same viewpoint that the world around them was using when it comes to thinking about honor and glory and high status and authority and position. They were thinking about it the way that they were accustomed to seeing, namely the way in which the Romans were carrying this stuff out with their extremely strict and well kind of developed and very big sort of a hierarchical system. They were thinking about kings. They were thinking about lords. They were thinking about governors. They were thinking about government officials who were given the ability to sort of reign over people. And in that world, and still in our world today, we still get trapped into this thinking that if I want to really have authority, if I want to really be important, really be in a place of honor, then I need to work my way up. I need to connect with people. I need to get on LinkedIn and start making friends with the CEOs around me. I need to go get a good education and just start working my angles and my networking and my relationships here so that I can move up and get into a better position. All for why? Well, for most of us, we're probably thinking about, well, because it means I get maybe I might get out of doing a little less work. I get a better paycheck. I can boss people around instead of being bossed around myself. There's all these things that start to play into it for us. And James and John were getting caught up in that same thinking, and they were trying to carry that over to the kingdom of God itself. And just kind of as a side note, James and John were not the only disciples that were doing this. You get later on into the Last Supper, which is still coming yet for in a couple weeks here. You get into the Last Supper and what you see happening at the Last Supper, the night that Jesus was betrayed, the night that he was actually taken captive, and this whole thing about the business, about the cross and his death actually started and really got rolling. The disciples, all of them, are depicted as sitting around and arguing about who was best in the kingdom. This is not just an epidemic, not just a problem for these disciples. It's a problem that we have in our own life as well. This desire for honor and glory. And they have this wrong understanding about what exactly it takes to have this position of honor in the kingdom. See, the disciples, it's easy to think, they have this unique position with Jesus. This unique relationship and access to Jesus. It's easy to think that they might have become conceited and thought, well, of course we're going to be the best. There's going to be Jesus sitting in the middle and there's going to be 6 of us on each side, kind of reigning over all of God's people. And they got swept up in that, and Jesus comes along and he says, you guys got it all wrong. You got it wrong. That's not the right way. That's not the way it's going to work. It's not about who has the highest position and status on earth. It's something else. He also throws in another line that we're quick to kind of glance over and miss here. In verse 23, at the end of verse 23, these places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father. It's not about what you can accomplish. It's not about who you know. It's about God. What is God's will? What is God about? What is he doing? What is his plan? And where do you fit into that? And that is what's going to be the ultimate decision. Let's keep going, verse 24. When the 10 heard about this, so the other 10 disciples, when the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the 2 brothers. And Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus is now getting explicit about something that's just kind of been subtly hinted at. Now, the way the world works and the way the world kind of sees its authority and its honor positions, that's not the way the kingdom works. It's upside down for how you're used to things working. It doesn't work that way. The inclination is to look at the world and to apply that to the kingdom. And Jesus says, no, it's backwards. It's backwards. See, there's 2 things, in a sense, there's 2 things that we can kind of start to pull out of this really at this point. And our first thing is just really to go back to Lewis again and the Great Divorce again, is that recognition that fame is not the same in heaven as it is on earth. See, we all want to be in a place of honor. We all want to have a high standing. We all want to think that when we get to heaven, God's going to sit there, or Jesus is going to sit there and pat us on the back and say, you're great. I love what you've done. Now come and sit right here at my right hand. That might happen. But then we also start looking around and we start thinking about, what do I need to do now in order to get to that spot? We start thinking, well, that person who's converted 100 people, I mean, clearly they've got a foot up on me. That person Jerry Dykstra, he's got a foot up because he was the executive director of our denomination. He's definitely going to be above me. Yeah, he's not here. Hopefully he'd be laughing if you heard me say that. I'm just hoping. I'm just throwing that in there. But we look at these people around us. We look at these people who might be great preachers, great Christians, great prayers, all these people who have all these things, these characteristics, these traits about them that we elevate, and we sit here and we say, no, that person, he's great, she's great. That person there, they're a way better Christian than what I am. They're going to have a much better position than what I'm going to be in. And we have these Christian rock stars among us that we tend to think are somehow closer to God and going to have that higher position. There's that aspect about it that fame on earth is not the same as fame in heaven. They're based on different things. There's a second piece of it that I did allude to, that it's all about what God's about. It's all about what God's about, and you can't get away from that. Because that helps us kind of keep things in perspective. It helps us to kind of keep things, sort of centered, and that gives us our foundation upon which we're working with here. I mean, they're clear. The takeaway, in so many ways, the takeaway for this passage is clear. We've probably all heard this message so many times before that, if you want to be great in the kingdom, you got to be a servant. That takeaway is clear, and it's there, and it's obvious, and we can jump right out on it, and we've heard it so many times before. Be a servant. Be a servant. But then you have Jesus, who creates that model on which that's based on. We have the very heart of the gospel that Jesus himself gets at here. And you start thinking about the fact that, Jesus, as disciples, we want to be like Jesus and imitate Jesus, the example that he modeled for us. But the reality is that we can never be a better servant than Jesus. Because Jesus, being God, he was sort of the authority of authorities. He was over everything. There was no higher authority, is no higher authority than Jesus himself. And yet what we see in his earthly ministry is we see him as God. I mean, that's pretty high up there. As God, he voluntarily makes himself a homeless, wandering slave to his own disciples. He makes himself a slave to the outcasts in society, to the women who more often than not were seen as property, to the several times divorced women at the well. He makes himself a slave to the lepers who were cast away and thrown out, and nobody wanted to get within 50 feet of them because they were afraid they were going to catch some disease. He makes himself a slave to fishermen, to boys who have no social status, and he washes their feet. We can't beat that. We can't be a better servant than Jesus himself. Because that's where the gospel in so many ways comes into this message. And we got to keep the gospel in perspective. We got to do that, because if we just simply leave this as go out and be a servant, what we can get ourselves trapped into is this thinking of trying to outserve one another. I don't know if you ever noticed that temptation that you ever feel. You look at this passage, you think about this concept, you think, well, and if I want to be a rock star in heaven, and so what do I need to do? I need to make myself the best servant I can possibly be. And we start competing with each other to see who can be a better servant. I don't know if you've ever seen that, and it's kind of this wrapped up in this weird sort of false humility that kind of starts to come into it, and it's just this weird dynamic, and that whole thing just defeats the purpose. And so we can get wrapped up in that. We can walk out of here and we can think to ourselves, well, you just go out and just do something more. But if you cut the gospel message out of it and how all of this is tied into the gospel, it all just simply becomes legalism. You're just going out and you're just doing more things. Or you're just, avoiding certain things or whatever it may do. It becomes legalism. The gospel is the whole reason as to why we even have the ability to serve. It's the whole reason as to why we can even do anything at all. So, there's a couple of warnings. One being that competition, that spirit of competition that we need to be aware of. Don't try to outserve those around you. Not going to do it. It's not going to get you anything. It defeats the purpose. There's a second aspect to this, second kind of warning that can oftentimes come up that might be maybe really applicable for us as a church right now, is when it comes to thinking about leadership positions. And I don't mean leadership just in the church. This applies equally even to leadership in the workplace or in the job place. Leadership just in general. It might be easy to look at Jesus' words here and think, well, because of that, because of what Jesus is saying about being a servant, that means that, well, I shouldn't be a leader. Almost like it's a sin to be a leader in any position. We can kind of get wrapped up in that. We can start to maybe kind of use that as an excuse of, well, if I get nominated for council, for example, or if I get asked to do something or lead a certain ministry, I really want to be a servant, and I'm not so sure that leading is right. So I'm just going to I'm going to decline. I'm going to say no. Because what I really want to be is a servant, and just leadership and servanthood just sorts of kind of act in some ways as a contradiction in our minds. But Jesus wasn't anti-leadership. And so the other side of things that can kind of come into that with leadership is also this idea that, it might be a sin to even desire being in a leadership position. And so you might be tempted, especially at your job, you might be tempted to just kind of sit back and never strive to move up, never strive to learn, never strive to grow, never strive to sort of move up in the organization, because you get caught into thinking that, well, if I desire to be a leader, if I desire a higher position, then that must be a sin, and that's something that I need to avoid too. And that becomes a really fine line, because desire can become a sin in certain aspects. But Jesus doesn't say that we shouldn't desire being in those positions either. What he does do is he says an awful lot about what it means to be a leader. An awful lot about how we conduct ourselves in leadership positions. And that to be a leader is through that Christian framework, through that gospel framework, through that model that Jesus leaves for us. To be a leader in that situation is to be a leader. You see your position as being in a better position to serve more people. Not like the Gentiles, not like the Romans, not to hoard it over people and to abuse your status, but to look at this position that you've been given as a calling and as a gift to serve more people. The higher up you are as a leader, the more people you have the opportunity to serve. It's the gospel speaking into this passage. It's the gospel speaking into our life. It's the gospel speaking into how exactly it is that we serve. And it's all based on Jesus' own actions. It's all based entirely on Jesus' own life, his own actions, his own ministry, and the things he did. Namely, the event that stands at the very center of the gospel, the cross. See, just before we picked up with our passage, just before in those verses 17 to 19 in chapter 20, back there, Jesus predicted his death a third time. And that in and of itself was hard. It was hard for the disciples to hear it one time, and now we got 3 times. And at the end of our passage today, down there, verse 28, Jesus essentially predicts his death a 4th time. He again says that this is why I'm here, this is what I'm doing. But this time, in verse 28, he uses an incredibly theologically loaded word. He uses the word ransom. It's the Greek word lutron. Lutron. And lutron, technically, literally, it refers to a price that is paid in order to free a slave. This is what Jesus says he's come to do, and who he is and what he's about. In verse 28, the price that Jesus refers to as his own life, and we know that story. The slaves that he is referring to are simply listed as the many, but we do know that and understand that as the slaves he's referring to, that's you, that's me, that's the disciples, that's everybody who has come to faith, who has fallen at the foot of the cross. See, it would be really easy, as I said, to walk out of here this morning with the idea that you need to go and serve a whole bunch of people in order to be saved. That's one way in which we could falsely and wrongly apply this text. But what we have in Jesus is a picture of exactly the opposite. Jesus died for you. He died for you. He paid. Emphasis on the past tense. He paid the ransom to free you from slavery. It's already been done. It's already completed. And it's because of the gospel that we even have the ability to serve. So we all want to be spiritual rock stars. I mean, just be honest with ourselves. We all want to be spiritual rock stars. We recognize the inherent upside downness of the kingdom that gets us there, that gets us to that spiritual rock star status. The first step is accepting the promises of the gospel of grace, the ransom paid on your behalf. If you haven't fallen at the foot of the cross and sanctified your own pride, or sacrifice, I should say, your own pride, and submitted to the lordship of Jesus, your servitude is nothing more than false humility. Hear the gospel. Be set free from slavery to sin. Let's pray.